Currently many countries are in a state of serious economic turmoil, and we all know that two countries that have seen the worst economic catastrophe in recent times are Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Seeing the trends, left us asking, is Africa's biggest economy on its way to becoming the next Venezuela? To answer that, we first have to quickly talk about what really went wrong in Venezuela. And how did a country with the largest oil reserves in the world lost everything and experienced one of the most devastating economic and humanitarian crises? Imagine a country with vast oil reserves, sitting on top of the world's largest deposits, a land of immense wealth and prosperity. That was Venezuela, once upon a time. But today, it is a country plagued by poverty, political turmoil, and economic instability. What happened to bring this once great nation to its knees? In the mid-20th century, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. Its oil reserves were the backbone of its economy, making it rich beyond imagination. In fact, as of 2016, Venezuela had 18.2% of the entire world's oil reserves. To put it into perspective, that's more oil than Qatar, China, Russia, United Arab Emirates, Norway, Brazil and Angola have combined. Venezuela rode the wave of its oil industry and exports, amassing wealth throughout the 60s and skyrocketing to obscene riches in the 70s when an OPEC embargo caused oil prices to quadruple almost overnight. However, this oil-fueled prosperity came with a cost as the country fell victim to the resource curse, or Dutch disease, a phenomenon where their economy became overly dependent on oil, and they failed to diversify their exports. Instead of using that oil wealth and diversify their economy like how Dubai did it by using its oil money to turn Dubai into a world-class business and tourist destination. By solely relying on the oil industry, the country's economic fate became tied to the fluctuations of the resource's price and demand. This meant that if the resource's value tanked, the entire nation's future would be in peril. It's a cautionary tale of the dangers of placing all your eggs in one basket. As luck will have it, or rather, as bad luck will have it, in the 1970s, the worldwide economic and energy crises significantly reduced the demand for oil and oil prices reached their peak. This resulted in people switching from large gas guzzlers to smaller vehicles, and ultimately contributed to the oil surplus of the 1980s. In 1980, the global price of oil reached a record high of approximately $35 per barrel, equivalent to $110 per barrel in 2020. However, by 1986, the price had dropped to below $10 per barrel, approximately $24 in 2020 values. As a result, Venezuela's oil, which had previously brought them great wealth and prosperity, became practically worthless in just a few years. This marked the beginning of the end of Venezuela's prosperity, as the government found itself in debt of $33 billion, with no projected income for the foreseeable future. In a desperate bid to salvage the situation, the government turned to the IMF, seeking financial assistance. However, the IMF's solution was one that had been prescribed to many other struggling nations before it, which are deregulation, privatization, and cutbacks on social programs. The government was forced to remove price controls on utilities and slash social programs to meet the IMF's demands. This led to widespread dissatisfaction among the Venezuelan people, who were already struggling to make ends meet. The cost of living soared, and the government's popularity plummeted as a result. The deceitful actions of politicians who implemented harsh austerity measures despite their promises caused widespread anger, leading to the Caracazo protests in 1989. Starting in Guarinas on February 27 and spreading to Caracas and other parts of the country, the protests were marked by violent clashes and looting. The government's brutal response to the protests, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds, shattered any remaining trust between the people and the state, effectively severing the thread that bound them together. Some sources even suggest that the number of fatalities may have reached into the thousands. The government's response to crises has always been a source of frustration, and their latest move was no exception. In an attempt to win favor with the people and stimulate the economy, they artificially inflated the value of the Venezuelan bolivar. The goal was to make imported goods more affordable, but the result was disastrous. The country's wealthy individuals were able to take advantage of the situation by investing in foreign currencies and opening offshore bank accounts. This protected their wealth from the unstable inflation rates and economic turmoil in Venezuela, But it also meant that the money was no longer serving the country. As you would guess, this move had a negative impact on the rest of the population. The artificially high bolivar made it difficult for domestic businesses to compete with cheaper imported goods. This lack of competition further suppressed growth in a country that was already overly reliant on oil and had not diversified its economy. The resentment among the people was amplified by the rampant corruption within the government, making it clear that their leaders were more concerned with their own interests than the welfare of the country. As the economy of Venezuela attempted to stabilize, it became clear that the damage had already been done. Inequality was at an all-time high, leaving the middle and lower classes with little hope for improvement. And then, like a beacon of hope, Hugo Chavez emerged. A former military lieutenant colonel, Chavez had already made waves in Venezuelan politics with his failed coup attempt 6 years prior. But this time, he had a different strategy. He tapped into the anger and frustration of the country's impoverished and working-class citizens, and used it to propel himself to the presidency in 1998 as a third-party candidate. Chavez was a leftist with a passion for social programs, and he wasted no time in implementing them. He spent the country's oil profits lavishly, creating an even greater dependence on oil for Venezuela. But in the short term, his policies benefited the poor, cutting poverty rates by 20% between 2002 and 2008. And the people loved him for it. However, the problems soon began to surface. Chavez's administration relied heavily on the oil sector, but he neglected to upgrade or even maintain oil facilities, resulting in a decline in production. And even worse, he refused to learn about the industry. This lack of diversification left the country entirely reliant on a single industry or resource for its survival, a critical lesson that Venezuelan leaders seem to repeatedly overlook. However, it is worth noting that this type of oversight is not exclusive to Venezuela, as we shall see later in the video. Secondly, as is typical with charismatic leaders who possess autocratic tendencies, Chavez believed he had supreme power, leading to the seizure of private wealth from those who opposed him, the appointment of unqualified friends and supporters to positions of power, and an expansion of military power and control. On June 2, 2010, Chavez made an incredibly detrimental financial move, declaring an economic war against private companies and the wealthy due to a drop in global oil prices. He attempted to slow capital flight and close the budget deficit by devaluing the bolivar, leading to rampant hyperinflation and a collapse of the import system that left the country in dire poverty. Previously one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, Venezuela's reliance on imports left its citizens resorting to a barter economy and often going hungry. The eventual sanctions on the country worsened the situation, with people struggling to access food, medicine, and basic necessities. Tragically, before facing the consequences of his actions, Chavez passed away from cancer in 2013, leaving behind a country in disarray. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, acted like he wasn't so impressed with how slow things were falling apart in the country. The economic collapse of Venezuela was nothing short of a catastrophe, with oil prices plummeting and widespread corruption and mismanagement. Maduro, sensing the unrest of the people, began to act more and more like a tyrant. He ruled by decree, arrested opposition leaders and journalists, and shut down any critical voices. He even spread the theory that his political opponents were part of an international conspiracy to ruin the country, which is now incredibly common now that I think about it. By 2016, inflation had reached a staggering 800%, the highest in the nation's history. Hunger had become so widespread that a study found 75% of the population had experienced involuntary weight loss. Violence had become rampant, fueled by people's desperation and the government's brutal crackdowns. With society in chaos and poverty at an all-time high, outside observers believed Maduro would lose the next election in a landslide. However, shockingly, he won. It was suspicious, to say the least, especially since he had barely won the previous election by just 1.6 percentage points. How did he manage to get re-elected after presiding over one of the worst periods in Venezuelan history? I will leave that for you to decide. Despite pressure from over 40 countries to step down, Maduro doubled down on his conspiracy theories and refused to relinquish power. It wasn't until 2019 that the National Assembly, one of the few remaining political bodies, declared the 2018 elections invalid. In a bold move, Juan Guaidó was declared acting president of Venezuela by the National Assembly. While he enjoys global support and a considerable following within the country, only that is not enough to put him in power. To summarize everything, the root of the issue lies in the resource curse, Venezuela's over-reliance on oil, combined with poor political and economic management, a lack of diversification, rampant corruption, and plummeting oil prices. To make matters worse, power-hungry leaders with no understanding of their own industries have implemented unsustainable policies and silenced opposition, leading to the utter decimation of Venezuelan society. So to go back to our earlier question, is Nigeria becoming the next Venezuela? With an abundance of natural resources, including oil, Nigeria has long been viewed as a potential economic powerhouse in Africa. But could that all be changing? Let's start by looking at Nigeria's oil industry, which has been the driving force behind the country's economy for decades. Nigeria is currently the largest oil producer in Africa and the 15th biggest in the world, with a daily output of 1.6 million barrels. In 2022, a staggering 80% of the country's national revenue came from oil exports, making it a crucial part of the country's economy. In comparison, oil accounts for 25% of Venezuela's GDP and 95% of its total exports. This means that while Nigeria is dependent on oil, it's not quite as reliant on it as Venezuela. But what about Nigeria's dependence on imports? According to the World Bank, Nigeria's imports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP is 16.57%, while Venezuela's is around 31.45%. In addition, Nigeria imports 41% of the food it consumes, while Venezuela imports at least 70% of what it consumes. This suggests that Nigeria is more self-sufficient than Venezuela and could be better equipped to weather economic storms. Another key factor to consider is currency devaluation. While Nigerian naira has lost 99.8% of its value from 1981 to date against the dollar, Venezuela bolivar has seen one of the worst currency devaluation in the history of money. Currently, $1 is equivalent to 2,425,370 Venezuelan bolivars, while $1 is equivalent to 460.5 Nigerian naira. As for inflation, both countries have struggled with high inflation rates. Nigeria's inflation rate reached a four-year high of 21.91% in February 2023, while Venezuela has experienced inflation rate of 210% in 2022 compared to the previous year. Political stability is another crucial factor to consider. Nigeria's political system is relatively stable compared to Venezuela's, which has experienced political turmoil and social unrest in recent years. This political instability has contributed to the economic crisis in Venezuela, with sanctions imposed by the international community and a significant decline in oil production. So, what's the bottom line? While Nigeria and Venezuela share some similarities in terms of their reliance on oil and economic challenges, Nigeria has a more diversified economy and is more open to the global economy. Additionally, Nigeria's political system is more stable than Venezuela's, which bodes well for its future economic prospects. However, Nigeria still faces significant challenges, such as insecurity and corruption, which could impact both foreign and domestic businesses. The good news is that Nigeria has the potential to address these issues and continue on a path of growth and development. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.